About a month ago, I was having a deep phone conversation with my friend and mentor, Laura Howell, about those murky, often unnamed leadership traits that can only be developed through hard-won wisdom. When you're in the middle of your greatest and perhaps seemingly insurmountable challenge, just how do you know when you should push through it with a growth mindset and gritty optimism versus when you should just cut bait? Today on The Behaviorist, we'll explore how we hone the powers and proper proportions of both grit and grace. Welcome to The Behaviorist with Work Wisdom, where we help you adopt high-performance mindsets, behaviors, communication, and culture. I'm your host, Kedren Crosby. Our intention for the Behaviorist podcast is to share accessible, concrete practices that you can weave into your whole life to begin a shift toward joy and meaningful achievement. We're grateful to have Laura Howell, Executive Director of Maryland Association of Community Services, and Catherine Ross, publisher of both Central Penn Business Journal and Central Penn Parent, with us today. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks for making the drive up.
Thank you so much.
Laura, you were my first real boss. You picked me up out of grad school and made me your intern, and you taught me all kinds of gritty habits that I shall never relinquish. Everything from how to build cohesion in a coalition of competitors and how to properly space a memo. Catherine, you also are a beloved friend who's skillful in both grit and grace. I remember when we were first supposed to have a meeting, a breakfast at Commonwealth on Queen, and I just completely didn't show up. I completely missed it. And not only did you forgive me, but you showed so much empathy because I had just started Work Wisdom and you knew what I was going through. So thank you both for being gritty and graceful friends of mine through the years. We also have a connection to University of Maryland, and Laura and I specifically to UMBC, and their tagline is grit and grace. We've seen such a change in UMBC over the decades since Laura and I went there. The work that Freeman Hrabowski has done has just been incredible, beyond belief, really, how he's taken this sleepy commuter college and turned it into one of the most innovative research institutions in the country. And he's done all of that through grit and grace. So that tagline is inspiring to us. Of course, the book Grit by Angela Duckworth has also been very inspirational to all of us. I read that book on a couple of airplane trips, and whenever I'm on a plane, my reading seems to stick with me. And what I really remember from that book is this idea that talent is important, but it's really perseverance that counts twice when we are thinking about a formula for success. So I wanted to think about this idea of that perseverance, that grit, and think about how we can hone it, maybe even how we can share our wisdom around grit for our listeners so that they can help develop their own grit. So Laura, I've been thinking about your career and all the world changing that you've done over the decades. Can you tell me how grit has counted twice in your own formula for success?
Well, thank you, Kedren.
Yes, absolutely.
It's great to be here. When I was thinking about this topic, I really thought how much I love the word grit, because I think it really conveys something very complex. And the more you think about it, the more you realize there are a lot of components. I think the first thing is what you endeavor to do. I think a lot of people who need and employ grit are trying to do something that's really challenging. You and I met in a homeless services program. We weren't homeless ourselves, but we were working in a homeless services program. And that is certainly a challenging and kind of gritty endeavor. And then I think how you do the work. So I think of things like perseverance, resilience. In my career, I've done a lot of advocacy, so it's a lot of systems change, which can certainly be challenging. And when I talk about my work, I often talk about pragmatic optimism. You have to even when something's really hard and seems almost insurmountable, you have to think that you can do it and that it's possible to succeed, but you have to be pragmatic about it. And I think all of those things are wrapped up in grit.
Yeah, it's such a great word, isn't it?
It is.
It really is. Catherine, can you tell us, when did you feel that you needed to be most gritty? And I don't know, did it come naturally?
Luckily, I was raised with two parents who set role models, guidelines of perseverance and hard work and ethics. And my personal experience had always been that if I worked hard enough, I could achieve my goals, whatever the endeavor was, building upon what Laura was talking about. And most of the time it always worked, whether it was through education or my personal life or other goals that we often talk about that we have to be getting in there and seeing it through. But again, building off what Laura was talking about, it's the pragmatic times when we were in the middle of that work and the grit and then we're going through and we realize that maybe what we're going through and we're getting to isn't the success that we expected or wasn't the outcome or that we necessarily wanted or foresaw. And so those times when I've had to actually be the most gritty were the ones where no matter how hard I worked, I wasn't going to be able to affect the change or the outcome I wanted. So I had to persevere in emotional vulnerability through that. So there was another type of emotional vulnerability of grit that it's a different type, not just getting down and dirty and doing it.
Yeah.
A personal time I would say, because I think it can be personal and professional, that we need to be working through is when my marriage ended.
Yeah.
And I had to face that my spouse just didn't want to be married to me, no matter how much I wanted to be engaged into that relationship. The other was when I had to come to terms that I did not enjoy being an external consultant, and it was time for me to close my business to take the next step in my career, and not seeing and saying, okay, this isn't the outcome where I thought this business was going to go pragmatically, but it's not where my joy is. And so how do I embrace that to vulnerability and grit to go through what was some uncomfortable times to be acknowledging that as well as doing the work. And truthfully, neither one of those times came easily.
Oh my gosh, I know. When it doesn't come naturally and you just have to think intentionally, okay, how am I going to behave right now? It doesn't feel normal.
And it doesn't. And Catherine, you and I have talked about how much we both enjoy the work of Brené Brown.
Yeah.
And I've been recently reading her book, Dare to Lead. And she's really into the vulnerability and how that grit is in there. And the one thing that I'm learning is that when you're in that sticky, ugly middle, that's really tough. And we have to, whether it's that emotional grit or the personal violence, is to be authentic with your trusted circle around you so that you're not isolating yourself. Because I think sometimes when we're in that most difficult part, we can isolate ourselves and we don't. That's a little bit harder. So that's one takeaway from her book that I've been doing.
That's really helpful. I'm actually working with a client right now who said the words I asked her some questions the other day and she said, well, I'm trying to figure out grit and grace. And I said, are you kidding me? Because we're doing a podcast on that on Sunday. And she said, yeah, you told me last week. And I said, oh, well, here I thought you were just thinking of, this new phrase. But I think there are a lot of people who need to learn, how do I stay gritty? How do I figure out how to be authentic and vulnerable when I'm in that messy middle? So I want to talk about this messy middle. So when we're working really hard and we don't necessarily see the needle moving, that efficacy, that agency isn't really, we're not really able to own it when we're in that messy middle. Rosabeth Moss Cantor, she has this phrase where she says, everything looks like a failure in the middle. And I've liked to think about that quote in a different way. I've liked to think about it and said to myself, remind myself that every success looks like a failure in the middle. So sometimes you're in the middle of something and you're trying to figure out, is this a failure? But then you can project out a couple of years and say, oh, well, maybe this is just the messy middle of this success, and it feels like a failure right now. That's, of course, where we need Laura's pragmatic optimism to get the reality check. So Brene Brown kind of talks about this idea when she talks about the messy middle as this place of optimal creativity, when everything's kind of broken apart and we don't really know what the future looks like. So you can come up with more innovation in that messy middle than any other time. William Bridges, who wrote Managing Transitions, calls this space the wilderness or the neutral zone, when you're in that dark spot in the middle, and it may be a failure or it may be a success, but you have to think about how to stay gritty in moving forward with that. So I want to talk about that idea, that messy middle, and what grit means in that messy middle. So how do we know when to power through the messy middle versus when to cut bait, when to walk away? So when you think about your own professional or personal lives, do you have any tips for the youngsters out there that are listening to us, or even for me, because I need some advice too? Is there a method? Is there a formula? Are there some decision rules? How can we be artful in figuring out that almost that sixth sense of when to stay in it? So, Laura, do you have any advice or wisdom on this one?
Well, that's a really good question, Kedren. When I was thinking about this, I think, honestly, and this may be a flaw, I was hard pressed to think of a time when I really walked away from the messy middle. And maybe it's the nature of what I do in advocacy that you really, it's very hard to give up. One of my favorite quotes is from Winston Churchill, which, he saw some very dark times when he thought Britain would fall to Germany. And his quote is, "Never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense." And so I think that's a lot of what we're talking about today is when does it make sense to walk away? And I think, honestly, that a lot of times people give up a little too easily. And that's why grit is so important. I do think that a lot of the time you have to think about adjusting the goal sometimes. And I think Catherine talked about that earlier, that, sometimes you go in with this, big, audacious goal, and sometimes it's not the right goal, or you need to think differently about it, or the timeline for it. And I think those are all the calculations you have to make when you're in the middle.
Absolutely. So, Catherine, how do you figure out when to power through versus when to walk away?
So building off of what Laura was saying, because I was saying a little bit earlier, we tend to bounce off quite often. I'm quite analytical, so I like decision trees. So I would tell you there are 3 variables that I apply. The first is my values. Does what I'm doing align with my values and ethics? The second is financial, because one should never risk beyond their means. And the last goes to Marie Kondo's sparking joy, the element. And while hers is about cleaning up, I also believe that what we're doing in our lives should be sparking joy there. And if you're in it, so while sparking joy is different for each of us, if you're in a situation where you know that the seedling of your joy will never be fed there, then that is a time that you should walk away. So I would tell you the first 2 are hard lines in my world. And then the second, while it's a gut feeling, I'll tell you, it eventually becomes just as clear as that hard line. So it's easy to have your ethics lines. It's easy to have your financial line. The joy, it actually becomes equally clear. So I think if people pay attention to those, that will help them measure.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're thinking about the messy middle, the wilderness, the neutral zone, what's it feel like? So is there a word that describes how it feels when you're in the messy middle? Laura, what's your word?
I don't know how you feel about this word, but I would say stressed. I don't know if other people feel that way. I find the messy middle usually a pretty stressful place, which I think can also make decision making challenging. So Andrew Zolli, who wrote the book Resilience, says that resilience is the ability of people, communities, and systems to maintain their core purpose and integrity among unforeseen shocks and surprises. And I thought that was a great description of the messy middle, the unforeseen shocks and surprises, the things that you couldn't anticipate, the challenges that you didn't see coming or that you were surprised by. And I think that the positive side of stress is it's an artifact of caring deeply about something. And, we all sometimes think, I can't be on social media, it really annoys me. But sometimes those memes are true. And the meme that we probably have all seen that, stress is really about caring deeply about something, I think to me, in an interesting way, kind of helps reduce the stress almost, because it reframes it into, I feel this way because I really care. And that's going to help guide me through that messy middle.
Yeah. So that's taking, so we differentiate between positive and negative stress. So there's eustress, which helps you grow and lean in and be gritty and resilient. And then there's distress, which just is going to give you a heart attack. So that's a great way to reframe that stress into something positive. Catherine, when you think about the messy middle and how your body reacts and how you feel, is there a word that comes to you when you think about the messy middle?
So after hearing Laura's answer, part of me was like, stress would have been really, really good. But I would, in all authenticity, for me, it can bloom into a form of this internal melancholy when we lead into not being able to see around the corner, when we can see the end of the tunnel, when we feel like we might get somewhere. It is easy to keep going, but when we feel like there might not be any control in that, or it's just you can't get out of the wilderness, for me, it does create a bit of a melancholy that then I have to make an effort to get out and engage with people who inspire me, read books that give me ideas, be around creative thinkers, set specific action plans to overcome it. But I think sometimes the melancholy that can go with that is not always honestly addressed.
Yeah, such a good point. So let's think about our listeners, and let's think about what advice we might share with our listeners to help them develop this artful approach to knowing, as Kenny Rogers would say, when to hold them, when to fold them, when to walk away, when to run. What advice would you share? So Catherine, what advice might you share?
My first instinct is to tell people to write them out. As I mentioned before, I have variables that I keep. As everyone thinks about what are the elements or the measurements that are important to them to have that element, is to write them out. I tend to create lists for each of the columns that I mentioned before and continually add and subtract to them. As time goes by, they get added of, okay, I'm making this here, or I'm feeling this, or this is getting closer to this particular boundary. And honestly, eventually the lists create clarity. Now, my lists tend to be mental ones that I keep in my head, but I would encourage others, whether they want to put them on paper or verbally create them and walk through them with a trusted mentor or coach that can help keep them accountable to it and explore it.
Yeah, absolutely. Great advice. Laura?
That is great advice. Catherine and I are probably a little yin and yang because it sounds like your first place is analytical, probably followed by gut. My first place is probably more my gut instinct, followed by analytical. So I think part of helping to decide whether to walk away is how important was the goal to start. Some things are easier to walk away from than others. Some things you really just have to keep working at it. And I know I keep saying it, but I think going back to that concept of being persistent, really, sometimes you can walk away from something that might have been achievable if you just stuck to it a little bit longer. So I think it's not only whether you walk away, but it's also figuring out what the right formula is for when you make that decision. And I think Catherine talked a little bit about really looking at, is continuing having a negative effect on you in ways that are too important to ignore. So if it's having a negative impact on you financially and your family, and your health, then you really have to look at those things. The cliche that, nobody was ever on their deathbed and said, I wish I'd worked more, certainly pertains. But when you try to achieve big things, that effort can take a toll. And it's really just all the balance of how do you take all of those things into effect. So I don't think they're ever easy decisions. And I think some combination of the analytical and the gut instinct and how important it is to get to that goal are all the things you have to factor in.
Yeah, and I also really like I like the interwoven approach, that we're doing a little analytical, a little gut, but I also like this idea of finding trusted partners to talk to, whether it's a friend who has high reality testing or a therapist or a coach or someone out there that we can throw all of these things up against. Really helpful. So let's think about the benefits of being gritty. If you could name one benefit to being gritty, what would be ranked at the top? So, Catherine, what's the top benefit of grittiness?
I would say magic. And what I mean by that is there's a drawing that I love. There's two circles. There's a larger one and a smaller one, a bit of a distance away. The larger circle, a lot of people might have seen this. It's labeled your comfort zone. And the small one further away is where the magic happens. And when we are having to be gritty, I swear it's not at least once, but most likely many, many times during these periods of grit, we have to step out of our comfort zone. However, at the end of it, it is where the magic happens in our lives. So at the end of the day, it's magic.
Yeah. I think we should rename this podcast Magic. Yeah. Gritty magic. Laura, what do you think when you think about the benefits of being gritty? What's at the top?
I think it's being successful in accomplishing hard things that matter. I don't know anyone who accomplishes hard things without a significant dose of grittiness. So in the formula of what makes magic, I think, grittiness is a huge piece of it. So, and I think that, that is priceless when you make a difference in the world through all that hard work and grittiness.
Yeah. When we think about world changers and how to help world changers be as high performing as possible, teaching grittiness in grad school, in undergrad, it should be a class, right? Yeah. Well, let's also talk about grace. So this term has a million shades within it. It means a million things to everyone. So in the context of leadership, it can mean that you stay classy and you choose not to shred someone, even if maybe they were behaving badly. It can mean giving someone a very long leash to become creative, maybe even to fail. I like that it's Parker Posey's white fluffy little dog, and now our little puppy is also named Grace. But what does grace mean to each of you? So Laura, when I say to you grace, what do you think that means?
Well, when I thought about the word and the question, I really thought, well, this is another word that sums up something complex, right? It's not something simple.
Yeah.
I think it also takes on a meaning specific to the circumstance that you're in, much like grit. It's when you're being tested that grace really comes into play. I think that's when we define how someone acts as having grace or being graceful. To me, it means acting with civility and kindness when maybe you want to act out of frustration or anger. And I think a really good metaphor for grit and grace is a duck who's paddling like crazy under the water and just looks like a serene, happy little duck above the water. And that, to me, it is a great metaphor for grit and grace.
Boy, that is fantastic. What do you think, Catherine? What does grace mean to you?
It's interesting as I contemplate the two different areas, because the one area is I reflect on Emily Post and the manners. And people often think of manners as these tried and true rules, but at the end of the day, the reasons the manners were there was to create space and courtesy and to help other people feel comfortable and never have them shame. It's to be courteous to others. At the same time, Mike Roche, he is the CEO of Pure Charity, which is a nonprofit consulting firm. He once wrote, "Grace means that all of your mistakes now serve a purpose instead of serving shame." And while we all need to give ourselves that same grace, but we also need to lead with and give that grace to others so they have the safe space to make their mistakes, so that their mistakes can serve a purpose as well. So I think that was the two different areas when I think about grace, of how can we each in our days be helping others create safe spaces.
Okay, so this is great. So when we're thinking about helping other leaders, even emerging leaders, develop grace, I want to think a little bit about how it feels to be graceful when leading. So, Laura, I can think of a million times that you were graceful when you were leading me. We're not going to talk about those on the air, but I do want us to explore this idea of what does it feel like when you're extending grace?
Well, I think I know a lot of people who seem to epitomize grace, you being one of them. And
I learned that from you. Internship.
It's very kind of you. I don't always feel like I exhibit as much grace as I would like to. I've been known to break my delete key, metaphorically. I don't know if your listeners feel that way, but sometimes when you're in the middle of that struggle of getting into a graceful place in your mind and you just write, delete, and write and delete. Yes, we've all been there. But I think for me, it gets down to empathy, that if you have empathy, and I think this fits in with what Catherine was talking about, if you can find empathy for people, again, and it always comes in those challenging times, I think that's what helps me to be kind when I might feel otherwise, because it really is kind of diverting that feeling and having impulse control, quite frankly, and saying, I don't think, when you watch people who seem to epitomize grace and it just seems like it just comes so easily to them, but I don't know if it comes as easily. The beauty of grace is that it seems like it does in the moment, even though you might be struggling internally with it.
I'm picturing Harriet right now. So, Catherine, when do you choose not to show grace, if ever?
Well, thank you. And of course, it is always my goal to be graceful. But I have to say, when I experience someone intentionally hurting others, especially the vulnerable, I can't help it. I just maybe tend to go a little Southern church lady who just and just lets it be known, because it needs you at that point in time. It's not showing that person grace, but you're actually creating grace for the person or the people that are being afflicted by that other person. So that's probably the only time that I would say I would consciously not
show grace. I know, it's such an interesting.
And I feel bad saying it, but I don't feel bad.
yeah. It's such an interesting concept. This idea of not showing grace, and when are times that it's okay to not show grace. So, Laura, do you have any times?
Well, listening to Catherine, it really makes me question, what does grace always look like? I mean, we've sort of defined it as, kindness and civility and all those things. But I think what Catherine described of really taking up for someone who may be vulnerable and is not being treated well, I do think that's a form of grace, quite honestly. And as somebody who's done a lot of work in fields that are very justice oriented, that is a lot of the time what makes you question whether you're being graceful, because you are faced with those inequities, that injustice. And I know that recently, I'll give you an example. I was in a public meeting and very purposefully made the decision to be a little tougher than maybe I normally would be in front of 150 people. And someone said to me, "Oh, you took the gloves off." But it was really done with a purpose to get to that end result. So I don't know if it was graceful or not, but it was certainly in the goal of seeking justice but doing it in a very decisive way.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. I think it's something that we should keep talking about. This idea of what does grace look like? How do we teach grace to others, to especially emerging leaders, especially emerging world-changing leaders? What does it look like? Maybe it looks different than how we were raised to think that grace looks. So what advice would you give our listeners regarding how to activate and even strengthen their gracefulness as a leader? Catherine, what ideas do you have?
So I think that's such a great implementation question, that people can take this idea and take it into their workplace or take it into their social world or their educational session. And the first advice I would have is to allow yourself to have that empathy and be vulnerable in a way that creates safe spaces for your team members to go through their own middles. I know this is often easier said than done, so I'd encourage anyone listening to read or get on Audible Brené Brown's Dare to Lead. And a while ago, reflecting, years ago, I had an employee come to me in a way, but it mirrored the same element. She was sharing that she didn't like her job, and that she knew it wasn't forever. And it was a very tense conversation. And in hindsight, I didn't handle it the way I wish I had, where I was like, well, you need to be accountable for this, and you need to be doing this. And over the weekend, then I reflected on what I had said to her. And I had remembered earlier in my career when I was in a role that wasn't a good fit. And I remembered having to hide, doing interviews, and feeling like I was failing because I was so miserable and it was the wrong job. So I circled back with her and I sat down and I said, I just want to have this conversation once again. You shared this with me. Well, I'd like to share with you, I was once in that same situation and I remembered feeling this way. So you are an important part of this team and you're very valuable, but I don't want you to stay here in a role that you don't like, and I don't want you to have to hide. So why don't we figure out a way that we can support you so that you can move on? We can help you determine what you might like to do. We can give you time to go on interviews. You don't have to feel that you are hiding anything from us, and I want you to know that we will support you in this journey. And so I think it's creating that safe space of not having, that wasn't about her performance, but it was about who she is and having that empathy, because she's in her middle right now, or was in her middle at that time. So that is the advice that I would give for people.
Yeah, that's so good. Laura, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, Catherine and I have very similar thoughts. I think being grounded in empathy for others is really key. And also being in touch with the regret that you can feel when you don't act with grace. I certainly know there have been times when I've looked back and thought, oh, I really wish I had handled that differently. And, you know, that regret is a motivator. It's not a very good feeling, you know.
Yeah.
But I guess the third thing I would say is that really looking to people you respect, whether it's a mentor, a friend, or a colleague, who you do see as a role model for handling challenging things with grace, and seek them out and talk with them. Because sometimes that act of having that conversation, first of all, helps you take a moment, take a breath, think about why somebody did something or why something was challenging, and take some of the air out of that desire to act out of emotion as opposed to grace. And then, you know, use that conversation to really think about how you want to respond to something. So I think the thing I would add to what Catherine said is take a breath before you act, and talk with people who you see as role models.
So thank you so much for that. I feel like our listeners are going to have much greater skill as they seek to become graceful leaders themselves. What I was hearing from both of you is this idea of how do we create psychologically safe spaces where we can show empathy, we can build empathy, maybe even in the culture where we tap the brakes, where we practice the pause principle. Maybe we even use our own regret and think about what's our do-over and how we would behave differently going forward. So those are 5 tips right there that can help all of our listeners as they grow.
And I'd like to add one thing is that we don't just have the one chance. If you've missed it, if you missed the opportunity to be graceful, the greater grace is to go back and show it. Take that time and say, I'm sorry I didn't handle this the way I should have, or I'd like to help improve that. So if we have that regret because we've all missed an opportunity at one point in time, is to sit there and say, can I go back and improve it? And sometimes it's harder and it's scarier to go back and admit that to somebody. But I think at that same time, it shows it's even a greater grace that they know that you've more meaningful because you've been reflecting on it, and it allows you to rectify a potential regret.
Yeah, that's really excellent. Okay, so let's think about one benefit of leading with grace. So when we think about what's beneficial about leading with grace, Catherine, what's at the top of the list? What's most beneficial about leading with grace?
I would say that I know that in my role, I am not saving the world or curing cancer. So at the end of the day, though, what I believe is that with grace, we can make the lives of the individuals around us and our teams better. And there's no greater joy or sense of purpose to be able to go at home at the end of the day and say, I helped improve somebody's life. I helped forward their mission, help create a safe space for them. So it actually becomes part of that purpose of my particular life day in and day out, because I don't have the skills to be doing greater things.
Oh, no. But yeah, if you can create a meaningful culture where people feel heard.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. That it doesn't matter what we do. If we can do that, that's great world-changing work.
And taking that time to listen. It's part of that culture.
Yeah,
so yes.
yeah, and you know, we often talk about 3 top tips for developing empathy and that kind of psychological safety. And the listening is the first part. You know, the second is looking for the person behind everything, and then the third is really actually talking to strangers. Those are all great ways to develop empathy. Laura, you're not just the executive director of this incredible organization. You're also a talented painter and a compassionate friend and a devoted wife. So I'm interested in this idea of weaving grit and grace as golden threads through all the facets of one's life. Do you have any advice around behaviors or habits that might foster whole life skillfulness with grit and grace, maybe even gritty grace?
Well, that's a big question,
Yes.
Kadrin. First of all, I want to say I feel like I'm incredibly lucky to have, an amazing wife and great friends, and most of the time work that feeds my soul.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good combination. And I think having gratitude for what you have actually helps you achieve gritty grace, to quote you. I do think that making time for things that both personally and professionally that give you the space to be able to do hard work in a way that is graceful is really important. That's why I went back to doing something creative and took up painting, which I think I did at a point in time where I was experiencing a tremendous amount of stress professionally, and I knew I just had to do something that would give me a place mentally, emotionally to do something that was different, that sort of fed my soul in a different way. From a professional standpoint, I will make a plug for something that I think is really important for the world-changing leaders that you work with, and that I've talked a lot about in the last probably 10 years, which is take time to take a sabbatical if you can. And not the kind of academic sabbatical where you're somewhere else doing research and still doing work, but it can be a short period of time. For me, it's been a 4-week sabbatical, and the definition between a sabbatical not being just a long vacation, but really being a time when you disconnect completely from work. And a lot of people tell me that they can't do it. There's no way that the business will survive or the organization will continue. And what I have said to them is that if you can't find 4 weeks in a 1 or 2 year period of time where you can be away, you need to really look at your organization, because they should be able to survive for 4 weeks without you. And I have done that, and it has really made a big difference in my ability to continue to do, justice seeking work in a way that is hopefully successful.
Yeah. R. Kate Coleman just wrote a column in your magazine, your journal, Central Penn Business Journal, about that exact concept. This idea that unless we are refueling, filling our cup, we can't be gritty and we can't be graceful. And we've probably all experienced that when we are so tapped out that there's just nothing left. We're more likely to just cut bait when it's not yet time, when we're still in the middle. And we certainly aren't extending grace to anyone, including ourselves.
Can I just add to that? I have to tell you, the first time I went to my board of directors and said, I'd probably been in my position about 10 years, and said, I need a sabbatical. It was really hard to do. There's, I think in our culture, there's almost shame around admitting that, look, I've been working like crazy, and I need a little time to build those stores of intellectual and emotional capacity. And but I'm so glad I found the ability to do it, and that they were receptive to it. So that's why I've become kind of someone who tries to urge my colleagues to find the courage to say the same thing, because most of the people I work with do actually need that kind of break to continue to do a long-term career in challenging work.
And gritty grace.
And to complement, in the business world, I have a friend who owns a business, and they take a month away every year, and they say it's the best time for them to be understanding the potential for their succession planning, because, and I believe that every manager and leader, if you're thinking about your career, you should be creating a team that can function without you for a month.
Yeah.
The wheels will not fall off in that amount of time. And so within the organizational structure, companies that create an environment where they don't think that people should leave, that they need them, it's not healthy for the organization or the individuals. So it should actually become part of the professional culture, because I believe it allows other employees to rise to opportunities.
I'm so grateful to both of you for being part of this movement of helping world changers in the workplace to enhance their individual and collective team performance. Thank you so much for talking about grace and grit with us today. Thank you, listeners, for downloading The Behaviorist, and we hope you'll subscribe. Please reach out to us through our website, workwisdomllc.com, where you can enjoy Work Wisdom Press, Work Wisdom Productions, ask questions, and make suggestions of topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes. Today, we'll leave you with some 1-minute wisdom from Anthony DeMello. The master was known to favor action over withdrawal, but he always insisted on enlightened action. The disciples wanted to know what enlightened meant. Did it mean right-intentioned? Oh no, said the master. Think how right-intentioned the monkey is when he lifts a fish from the river to save it from its watery grave.